The most powerful weapon in the modern world is not a missile, a tank, or an army. It does not explode. It does not march. It does not even make a sound. And yet it quietly decides which countries rise, which fall, and which are allowed to exist at all. That weapon is the US dollar. Most people think of money as something simple. You earn it. You save it. You spend it. But on the global stage, money becomes something else entirely. It becomes leverage. It becomes permission. It becomes a form of control more subtle than war and more permanent than occupation. Because when your economy runs on someone else's currency, your future is no longer fully your own. After the Second World War, the United States did not conquer the world with soldiers. It did something far more sophisticated. It redesigned the global financial system so that almost every country on Earth would need dollars to survive. Trade, energy, debt, and international banking were all wired into a single network, and at the center of that network sat one currency, backed not just by gold or trust, but by the largest military and political machine in human history. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to a quiet meeting in 1944, in a small town called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The war was still raging, but America already knew it would win. And while the world's leaders were still focused on bombs and borders, the United States was thinking about something more important: who would control the money when the fighting stopped. Representatives from 44 countries gathered in that hotel, desperate to rebuild a shattered world. Europe was in ruins. Asia was broken. Their currencies were unstable, their economies drained. America, on the other hand, held most of the world's gold and had the only industrial economy left standing. That imbalance gave the United States an opportunity that appears maybe once in a century. The deal was simple on the surface. Every major currency would be tied to the US dollar. And the dollar would be tied to gold. It sounded fair. It sounded stable. It sounded like a path to peace. But what it really did was turn the dollar into the beating heart of global trade. From that moment forward, if you wanted to import goods, settle debts, or stabilize your currency, you needed dollars. And if you needed dollars, you needed access to the American financial system. That was the birth of the shadow dollar. A system where the United States could influence the world not by invading it, but by pricing it. Not by conquering governments, but by controlling the currency those governments depended on. Over the decades, this system became so deeply embedded that most people stopped noticing it. Oil was priced in dollars. Global loans were issued in dollars. Reserves held by central banks were stored in dollars. Even rival nations that publicly opposed the United States quietly held massive amounts of its currency, because without it, their economies would freeze. This created a strange and dangerous paradox. The more powerful a country became, the more it had to rely on the very currency issued by its greatest competitor. And that dependence gave the United States a form of power that no empire in history had ever possessed: the ability to financially isolate any nation on earth with the flip of a switch. But this power did not come without a cost. To supply the world with dollars, the United States had to print them. And to keep the system running, it had to borrow, spend, and expand its own debt. The entire planet was now tied to the financial health of a single country, and that country was running on credit. For a while, it worked. The global economy grew. Trade exploded. Living standards rose. And the dollar became so trusted that people stopped questioning it. But beneath the surface, a quiet imbalance was forming. A system designed to give stability was slowly becoming a machine that transferred wealth, not just between countries, but between classes, between industries, and between generations. And today, that machine is straining. Because when the world's money flows through one nation's currency, that nation gains extraordinary power. But it also carries extraordinary risk. Every interest rate decision, every debt ceiling fight, every political crisis inside the United States now sends shockwaves across the planet. This is not just the story of a currency. It is the story of how global power was redefined. Of how money replaced armies. of how control moved from borders to balance sheets, and of how a single dollar became the invisible thread tying together the fate of every nation on earth. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. One quiet meeting in 1944 decided who would control the world without firing a single shot. In July of 1944, while the Second World War was still tearing continents apart, something far more important than any battlefield was taking place inside a quiet mountain resort in New Hampshire. The war would end with bombs and treaties. But the world that followed would be shaped by numbers, ledgers, and currencies. And the men who gathered at Bretton Woods knew it. 44 nations sent their top financial officials. Europe was exhausted. Asia was devastated. Entire economies had been flattened by years of war. Their currencies were weak, unstable, and in some cases nearly worthless. Inflation had wiped out savings. Governments were drowning in debt. Trade between nations was broken. Everyone in that room was desperate for stability. The United States walked in with everything no one else had. America held more than half of the world's gold. Its factories were untouched. Its infrastructure was intact. Its economy was booming from wartime production. While the rest of the world was scraping for survival, the U.S. was sitting on the largest pool of financial power ever assembled by a single country. And it used that advantage brilliantly. The official goal of Bretton Woods was to prevent another Great Depression. Leaders remembered the chaos of the 1930s, collapsing currencies, trade wars, and economic nationalism that helped lead to global conflict. The idea was to create a system where currencies were stable, trade was predictable, and governments could not destroy their economies through reckless money printing. But the way they chose to achieve that goal changed history. Instead of backing every currency with gold, which most countries could not do, they chose one currency to anchor them all, the US dollar. Every participating nation would tie its money to the dollar. And the dollar would be tied to gold at a fixed rate. This meant the dollar became the bridge between every economy on earth. If you were France and you wanted to trade with Japan, both of you needed dollars. If you were Brazil and wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. If you were Germany and wanted to stabilize your currency, you needed dollar reserves. From that moment forward, the US dollar was no longer just America's money. It became the world's money. On paper, this looked like cooperation. In reality, it was something much more powerful. Because whoever controls the global reserve currency controls the bloodstream of the global economy. Every country now needed dollars to function. And the only place those dollars came from was the United States. This gave America an extraordinary privilege. It could run trade deficits without collapsing. It could import goods and export paper. It could spend more than it earned, because the world needed its currency. Other nations had to balance their books or face disaster. The U.S. didn't. Its debt became everyone else's reserves. And the world accepted this deal because they had no choice. Their cities were in ruins. Their populations were starving. Their governments were unstable. America offered reconstruction, loans, and access to the global system, but only through the dollar. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe. It locked Europe into the dollar system. This was not colonialism in the old sense. No flags were planted. No armies were stationed. But the effect was just as real. Because once your economy depends on another country's currency, you don't need to be conquered. You are already connected. And that connection would soon become a leash. By the 1960s, the world was swimming in US dollars. Countries held them as reserves. Banks used them for international settlements. Commodities were priced in them. But behind the scenes, the U.S. was printing far more dollars than it had gold to back. The system was cracking. Foreign governments, especially France, began to realize what was happening. They held stacks of U.S. dollars, but when they tried to exchange them for gold, the vaults were not deep enough. The dollar was becoming a promise that could no longer be kept. In 1971, the United States made a decision that should have collapsed the entire system. It simply stopped paying. President Richard Nixon closed the gold window, ending the dollar's convertibility into gold. The world was now running on pure trust. A currency backed not by metal, but by power. And instead of rejecting the dollar, the world doubled down on it. Because by then, there was no alternative. The empire of money had replaced the empire of land. And the United States sat at its center. When gold failed, America found something even more powerful to back its currency. When the dollar was cut loose from gold in 1971, it should have collapsed. For nearly 3 decades, every country on earth had trusted that US dollars could be exchanged for something real. When that promise was broken, the logical outcome was panic, inflation, and abandonment of the dollar as the world's anchor. But that didn't happen. Instead, something far more subtle and far more brilliant took place. The United States found a new way to give its paper money value, not by tying it to metal, but by tying it to the one thing every modern economy could not survive without: energy. In the early 1970s, the world was becoming dependent on oil at a scale never seen before. Cars, factories, ships, electricity grids, plastics, fertilizers, food production, everything ran on petroleum. Whoever controlled oil pricing controlled the nervous system of civilization. The US made a deal that changed the planet. Behind closed doors, Washington reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia, the most powerful oil producer in the world. In exchange for military protection, political support, and access to American weapons and technology, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil exclusively in US dollars. No dollars, no oil. Once Saudi Arabia agreed, the rest of OPEC followed. And overnight, the world entered a new financial reality. If any country wanted to buy oil, it had to first obtain US dollars. If it wanted to run a modern economy, it needed access to oil. If it needed oil, it needed dollars. This was not an accident. It was a design. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by necessity. Every nation now had to earn or borrow dollars to survive. This forced countries to sell goods, provide labor, or take on debt in order to obtain the currency America controlled. The US, meanwhile, could print those same dollars at will. This created one of the greatest asymmetries in financial history. America could buy real things, oil, metals, labor, technology, with currency it created from nothing. Other countries had to work for it. This is what economists later called exorbitant privilege, but to the rest of the world, it felt like something else entirely. A system where one nation could live beyond its means forever, while everyone else had to balance the books. And it worked. Oil producers recycled their dollars back into US banks. Those banks then lent that money around the world, often to the very countries that needed dollars to buy oil in the first place. Debt piled up. Dependence grew. The dollar system became self-reinforcing. The world was no longer just using the dollar. It was trapped inside it. If a country tried to trade oil in another currency, it faced immediate financial isolation. Without dollar access, its banks struggled. Its imports slowed. Its economy suffocated. And behind all of this was something far more powerful than any army. Control over money flows. America did not need to invade. It did not need to occupy. It simply needed to control the currency the world ran on. And as long as oil was priced in dollars, the dollar was untouchable. The empire was now invisible, but absolute. When countries borrow in dollars, they don't just owe money, they surrender leverage. Once the world was locked into using the dollar to buy oil, trade, and settle international accounts, a new reality quietly took hold. Nations didn't just need dollars to function. They needed more dollars than they could earn. And that gap could only be filled one way: debt. Banks, Corporations and governments outside the United States began borrowing heavily in US dollars. It made sense at first. Dollar loans were cheaper. Dollar markets were deeper. Dollar funding was easier to access. But this convenience came with a hidden cost that would surface again and again over the decades. When you borrow in a foreign currency, you are no longer in control of your own financial fate. If a country borrows in its own currency, it can always print more money to repay the debt. It may cause inflation, but it won't default. But when a country borrows in dollars, it must earn dollars to repay. It cannot create them. It must export more than it imports. It must attract foreign investment. It must keep its economy open and compliant. This turned dollar debt into a leash. Throughout the late 20th century, developing nations piled up massive amounts of US dollar debt. Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, governments borrowed to build infrastructure, stabilize currencies, and fund development. But when global conditions shifted, the trap snapped shut. If the US raised interest rates, dollar debt suddenly became more expensive. If capital fled to American markets, emerging economies lost the dollars they needed to pay their bills. Their currencies fell. Their debts exploded. Their governments collapsed. We saw it in Mexico in the 1980s. In Asia in 1997. In Russia. In Argentina. Again and again, countries that seemed stable were suddenly brought to their knees by forces they could not control. And each time, the solution came from the same place. The International Monetary Fund. The IMF, backed heavily by U.S. influence, offered rescue loans, in dollars, but only if countries agreed to strict conditions. Governments were forced to cut spending, privatize industries, open markets, and restructure their economies. These were called reforms. In practice, they transferred power and assets to foreign investors and global financial institutions. The crisis did not weaken the dollar system. It strengthened it. Countries became more dependent on dollar liquidity, more fearful of defying the system, more cautious about challenging the rules. Because when the dollar system turns against you, it doesn't just raise prices. It shuts down your economy. This is how financial power replaced colonial rule. No soldiers were needed. No flags were raised. The control was exercised through interest rates, capital flows, and debt contracts. And the world learned a brutal lesson. If you are not the one who prints the currency, you will always be the one who pays. When money is global, whoever controls it can decide who gets to survive. For most of history, punishment between nations came in the form of armies, blockades, and bombs. But in the modern world, something far more precise and far more devastating has taken their place. Financial isolation. And at the center of that power sits the US dollar. Because when nearly all global trade flows through a single currency, and nearly all international banking passes through institutions connected to it, the country that controls that currency controls access to the global economy itself. This is how sanctions became one of the most powerful tools of the American empire. When the U.S. government designates a country, a bank, or even an individual as sanctioned, it doesn't just block trade. It blocks money. Dollar transactions are cut off. Banks that process those payments face penalties. Corporations that do business with the target risk losing access to U.S. markets. And because the dollar is embedded in nearly every international transaction, the effect is immediate and suffocating. Even countries that are not allies of the United States are forced to comply. A European bank, an Asian shipping company, or a Middle Eastern oil trader may have no political loyalty to Washington, but they all need access to dollar markets. The risk of being excluded is too great. So they obey. This creates a form of power unlike anything in history. A nation can be economically erased without a single shot being fired. We have seen this play out in real time. When Iran was cut off from the dollar system, its currency collapsed, imports vanished, and inflation soared. When Russian banks were restricted after geopolitical conflicts, entire sectors of the economy were thrown into chaos. Even large countries with resources and military strength found themselves struggling to function without access to the global financial network. This is not because they lacked oil, factories, or people. It is because they lacked dollars. The system that began as a way to stabilize trade had become a way to enforce obedience. And what makes this power so effective is that it is invisible. There are Northwest soldiers on the street. No tanks rolling through cities. Just transactions that suddenly stop working. Payments that bounce. Imports that never arrive. Salaries that cannot be paid. The modern world runs on money flows. And the dollar controls the valves. This is why no country can truly ignore American financial power. Even rivals who publicly challenge U.S. influence quietly build their reserves in dollars. Even enemies trade through dollar channels when no alternative exists. Because to be outside the dollar system is not to be independent. It is to be isolated. What looks like domestic policy in Washington sends shockwaves through every economy on Earth. To most Americans, the Federal Reserve is just another government institution. It sets interest rates. It fights inflation. It tries to keep the economy stable. But outside the United States, the Fed is something very different. It is the invisible engine that drives the global financial system. Because when the dollar is the world's currency, the institution that controls the dollar controls global liquidity. Every time the Federal Reserve raises or lowers interest rates, it doesn't just affect mortgages in New York or loans in California. It reshapes capital flows from Brazil to Turkey to South Africa. When the Fed lowers rates, dollars flood the world. Investors chase higher returns in emerging markets. Money pours into foreign stocks, bonds, and real estate. Economies grow. Currencies strengthen. Governments borrow easily. When the Fed raises rates, that tide reverses. Money rushes back to the United States. The dollar rises. Emerging market currencies fall. Dollar debts become harder to pay. Inflation explodes. Crises appear where stability once existed. This cycle has repeated for decades. And no foreign government gets a vote. A central banker in Washington makes a decision based on U.S. inflation or employment. A factory in Vietnam closes. A housing market in Mexico crashes. A government in Africa struggles to service its debt. This is not intentional cruelty. It is structural power. The Fed is mandated to serve the U.S. economy. But because the dollar is global, every decision it makes ripples outward. The rest of the world lives in the shadow of American monetary policy. In moments of crisis, this power becomes even clearer. During financial panics, global banks scramble for dollars to survive. Trade freezes. Credit dries up. And then the Federal Reserve steps in, opening dollar swap lines to select foreign central banks. Those who receive access are saved. Those who do not are left to suffer. This is how financial hierarchy is enforced. Not through speeches, but through liquidity. The Fed may not see itself as an empire. But the world experiences it as one. Every empire looks permanent, until it doesn't. For decades, the dollar system has appeared unshakable. It survived wars, crises, financial collapses, and political upheaval. But beneath the surface, something has been slowly changing. More and more countries have begun to question whether it is safe to live inside a system controlled by another nation. China started signing trade agreements that bypassed the dollar. Russia began selling energy in other currencies. Nations targeted by sanctions searched desperately for alternatives. Gold reserves quietly increased. Payment systems were redesigned. Digital currencies were explored. Not because the dollar suddenly stopped working, but because it worked too well for the country that controlled it. The more the United States used the dollar as a weapon, the more it revealed the vulnerability of everyone who depended on it. If access to the global financial system could be cut off with a signature in Washington, then no nation was truly sovereign. This realization triggered a slow, careful shift. Not a revolution, but a diversification. Countries did not abandon the dollar overnight. That would have been catastrophic. Instead, they began hedging. A little more trade in euros. A little more in yuan. A little more in gold. A little less in dollars. The goal was not to destroy the system. It was to survive it. Because history shows that every dominant monetary system eventually overreaches. And when trust breaks, it breaks suddenly. No currency collapses because of enemies, it collapses when the world stops believing in it. The US dollar does not dominate the world because of military power alone. It dominates because of something far more fragile: trust. Every country that holds dollars believes those dollars will still be valuable tomorrow. Every central bank that stocks its reserves with US currency believes the system will continue to function. Every investor who buys US debt believes the United States will always be able to pay. But trust is not permanent. It is built slowly and lost suddenly. The more dollars that are created, the more that trust is tested. The more US debt rises, the more foreign governments wonder how long it can be sustained. The more the dollar is used as a weapon through sanctions and financial pressure, the more other nations look for ways out. None of this means the dollar is about to disappear. Empires do not fall overnight. But it does mean the system is entering a more fragile phase. For the first time since World War II, large economies are actively preparing for a world where the dollar is not the only option. Payment systems are being duplicated. Trade agreements are being rewritten. Reserves are being diversified. Not because the dollar is weak, but because it is powerful. And power always creates resistance. The next battle for global power won't be fought with bombs, it will be fought with code. For most of modern history, control over money required physical infrastructure. Banks, vaults, printing presses, armored trucks. But that world is disappearing. In its place is something far more fluid and far more dangerous. Digital money. Governments and central banks around the world are racing to build their own digital currencies. These are not cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. They are state-controlled, programmable versions of national money. Central bank digital currencies promise faster payments, greater efficiency, and tighter control over financial systems. But they also create something new: perfect surveillance. Every transaction can be tracked. Every payment can be monitored. Every account can be frozen or altered instantly. Money becomes software. And whoever controls the software controls behavior. This is where the future of the dollar system becomes truly unsettling. If the US dollar becomes fully digital, its reach could become even more precise. Sanctions would be automated. Financial pressure would be instantaneous. Access to the global economy could be switched on or off with a keystroke. At the same time, rivals are building their own systems. China is developing digital payment networks designed to operate outside Western control. Other nations are exploring alternatives that reduce dependence on the dollar. This is not just technological competition. It is a fight over who controls the rails of global money. And once those rails are digital, whoever owns them will shape the world in ways history has never seen. When global empires shift, ordinary people always feel it first. Most of what you've heard so far sounds distant. Nations, banks, currencies, power struggles between governments. But the truth is, the dollar system reaches directly into your daily life in ways most people never notice. The price of your food, your rent, your fuel, your phone, your electricity, all of it is shaped by the global role of the dollar. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, it strengthens the dollar. A stronger dollar makes imports cheaper, but it also makes debt more expensive and global trade more unstable. When the Fed prints money, it weakens the dollar, driving up the price of assets like stocks and real estate while quietly eroding the value of your savings. These are not abstract forces. They decide who gets rich and who falls behind. If you own assets, inflation can make you feel wealthier. If you rely on wages, inflation eats you alive. The same system that gives Wall Street liquidity takes purchasing power from Main Street. This is why inequality has exploded alongside the dollar's dominance. Money flows upward because the system is designed that way. And as digital currencies and new financial tools emerge, this divide may grow even sharper. Those who understand how the system works can protect themselves. Those who don't are trapped inside it. The shadow dollar doesn't just control nations. It controls futures. The most powerful empire in history doesn't fly a flag, it prints a currency. When people think about global dominance, they imagine aircraft carriers, soldiers, and nuclear weapons. But the true center of power in the modern world is far quieter. It exists in balance sheets, clearing houses, interest rate decisions, and the green paper that moves between them. The US dollar built an empire without conquest. Through Bretton Woods, oil pricing, debt markets, sanctions, and central banking, America created a system where the world runs on its money. Not because it was forced to, but because there was no alternative that could match its scale, stability, and reach. This gave the United States a form of power no empire before it ever possessed. The ability to fund itself by exporting currency. The ability to influence foreign economies without direct rule. The ability to punish, reward, stabilize, or destabilize entire nations through financial flows. And the most remarkable part is that most people never see it. There are no headlines when a currency quietly loses purchasing power. No breaking news when a country becomes more dependent on dollar debt. No images on television when a payment system cuts someone off from the global economy. But the effects are real. This invisible empire shapes what countries can buy, what governments can spend, and what futures are possible. It is not good or evil. It is simply powerful. And in a world built on money, power follows the currency. The shadow dollar is not a conspiracy. It is a structure. And until something replaces it, the world will continue to orbit around the currency that made America the financial center of the planet.